were these sheep and lambs? Now, certainly the Jews were the sheep. Ezekiel's reading today tells us that the Jews compared them explicitly to sheep that would be rounded up. But who were the lambs? And how did they fit into the picture? From the beginning, Gentiles were drawn to Jesus' message. As Paul's missionary journey took it hither and yon, more and more Gentiles wanted to be Christ's followers. That's where the problem arose. The greatest conflict, bar none, that the church has ever faced. What to do with those Gentiles? Many of the leaders, including James, who is Jesus' brother and head of the church in Jerusalem, said they've got to become Jews. The males have got to be circumcised, they've got to follow all the purity laws and all the rituals. But Paul disagreed. He believed that Jesus had established a new covenant, a new arrangement. The Jewish laws were no longer in effect. In a passage in Galatians we all know, Paul says, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for we are all one in Jesus Christ. Gentiles, in Paul's view, did not have to worry about keeping the law. Now, Paul's view was explosive. It was a radical, divisive idea. I can only imagine the apostles' reaction when Paul sprung this idea on them. He was an upstart, a Johnny-come-lately, a man who started his life persecuting the Christians. Who was he to tell them what to do? In this conflict, initially Peter and Paul were on different sides. In Galatians, Paul even reports scolding Peter publicly for hypocrisy about this issue. You see, Peter said he wanted the Gentiles to be part of the church, but he refused to eat with them. Paul took him to task in front of a large crowd for that. This conflict almost ended the church before it began. The debates became so bitter and so divisive that the leaders called a council in Jerusalem in the year 50 to talk about it. Paul knew exactly where he stood. Peter initially disagreed. If Peter and the other church leaders stood firm, Paul would not win the argument. The fate of the church hung in the balance, and Peter, our Peter, was the key. Before the council, God intervened and spoke to Peter in a remarkable dream. A sheep came down from heaven bearing all kinds of unclean food. And Peter heard the words, eat. Now, Peter was not the swiftest of men. He was not the brightest bull. It took 3 times of hearing the word eat before God finally said to him, look, Peter, anything that I say is clean. You don't have to worry about unclean stuff anymore. Finally, Peter got the message. God had called the Gentiles to the table. He should not stand in their way. He understood that he needed to give up things that were dear to him, things that were vital to his whole being, to follow what he heard God saying. Now, Peter wasn't about you, and that was hard. But even harder was agreeing with Paul. You see, we know Paul. We can only imagine that it took a lot of crow eating for Peter to side with Paul. That decision at the council in 50 to allow Gentiles to enter the church without being Jews produced a split between Jews and Christians that persists to today. But it is the reason that almost every one of us in this room can be Christians. And it probably would not have happened without Paul's strong views and Peter's willingness to let go of his old ideas. They overcome their differences to work together. They went beyond conflict to find truth together. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the very most important lesson that Peter and Paul teach us. Truth emerged when they acknowledged their differences, recognized the conflicts in their different views, then discerned together what God was saying. The church always needs people like Paul. People who call us to be and become different. That can be very hard for traditionalists like Peter. Truth emerges in our communities. Our path for the future becomes clear when we welcome different viewpoints. listen to the prophets among us and try to hear God's call to us, which is always toward the new life. Prophets always point to the future. That's hard for traditionalists who love the past so dearly and who do the important work of keeping us connected to the good things in that past. Conflict, no matter what you have heard, is neither good nor bad. It is a fact of life. Conflict can be redemptive and helpful, as it was between Peter and Paul, or it can be divisive and destructive when we ignore it, try to suppress it, try to shout each other down, or ignore our differences. Peter and Paul remind us that God created diversity to give help to our community. Diverse opinions and conflict are the only path to discovering truth. Peter and Paul had to listen to each other and work together. Peter needed Paul, and Paul needed Peter. That's why God created both of them and brought them together. The church desperately needs different views and healthy conflict. The invitation to us to ponder today is, where are the Pauls in our midst? Where are the people you disagree with, those who push your buttons? Those are the people you need to talk to and listen to. Through diversity, God sparks creativity. The future is never a reliving of the past. The future is always a new creation. Peter reminds us of the values of the past that are important for us to say at times. But Paul points us toward the future. Paul and Peter challenge us to understand that our differences, the differences God created in us, are the very lifeblood of the church. As we move forward as a community of faith,